Hello, everyone. My name is Giuseppe Martinico, and I'm a full professor of comparative public law at the Sant'Anna School of Advanced Studies in Pisa. I'm also one of the editors of the Diritti Comparati. And today I have the immense privilege of interviewing Professor Cheryl Saunders, who is one of the most important comparative law scholars. She's a giant in our discipline. So thanks indeed for accepting our invitation, Cheryl. Cheryl is, it's our pleasure indeed. She's the founding director of the Center for Comparative Constitutional Studies at the University of Melbourne. Cheryl Saunders is a laureate professor emeritus at the University of Melbourne. She has a specialist interest in Australian and comparative public law, including comparative constitutional law and method, intergovernmental relations, and constitutional design and change. She is a president emeritus of the International Association of Constitutional Law, a former president of the International Association of Centers for Federal Studies, a former president of the Administrative Review Council of Australia, and a senior technical advisor to the Constitutional Building Program of International IDEA. IDEA stands for the Institute for Democracy and Intellectual Assistance. She has held visiting positions in law schools in many parts of the world and is an officer of the Order of Australia and the Chevalier d'Ordre National de la Légion d'Honneur of France. Thanks indeed again for accepting our invitation. And that would immediately go to the first question, Cheryl. And the first question is the following. In 2019, you published a seminal piece entitled Towards a Global Constitutional Gene Pool. If today you were asked to reflect on the methodological considerations made on that occasion, what would you change or update in that piece? Thanks indeed.
Thanks, Giuseppe. And can I begin by saying what a pleasure it is to be discussing these matters with you. It's great to have the opportunity to do it. So look, I wrote Gene Pool in order to pull together my own thoughts about how to engage effectively with the challenges of comparative constitutional law if we took seriously the range and variety of the nearly 200 constitutional systems of the world. 20 years later, if I were to write it again, I think the message would be much the same, that we live in a world with significant, if complex and changing, constitutional diversity from which we can all benefit. But I guess I'm now much more confident about where I stand on some of those issues, particularly on the core tension between universalism and difference, which I expect would be reflected in a new version of this piece. I'm now comfortable in accepting that tension as an ongoing conundrum to which there is no final answer, and it can best be tackled by understanding its component parts for particular comparative purposes. In essence, it's a kaleidoscope. But in addition, quite a lot's happened in the last 20 years, which I would certainly touch on in an updated version. And let me just mention two groups of things. One, the new literature that's come out over that period, and secondly, new developments in the theory and practice of constitutional law. As far as new literature is concerned, there's a lot of it. There's much more writing on the methodology of comparative constitutional law, which would make it potentially unnecessary to focus as much as I do in Gene Pool on the methodology that we derive from comparative law, although I must say I still find that useful. There's now a very considerable literature on big N studies in constitutional comparison, which would certainly deserve a mention. It faces its own methodological problems, as I'm sure you know, and feeds into the debate on universalism, but of course would be discussed in this context. There is a huge literature on global constitutionalism, which has come out over the past 20 years. Much of that deals with the constitutionalization of the international or supranational levels of government, but it has at least indirect implications for comparative constitutional law, which certainly would need exploration. Contrasting with that, in a sense, there's an emerging literature on the global south. How do you handle countries that you might loosely assign to the global south in comparative constitutional law? And in association with that literature, there's other strands of it on the potentially related phenomena of legal pluralism, hybridity, and constitutional culture. And I see signs of growing interest in other new subfields as well. For example, the relevance of language in comparative constitutional law, in constitutional concept formation, and the possibilities of subjectivity and objectivity. So I like to think that if I were to revise the article, I would try and weave all of that in somewhere. And then if I can just touch on my final point here, the developments in the theory and practice of constitutional law over the past 20 years. And of course, there's been a lot of those as well. But those concerning practice involve, for example, the rise of authoritarianism in a multitude of forms and various examples of pushback against globalization. To some extent, those two things are connected, but not entirely. And developments involving theory or doctrine include the conceptions of constitutional identity and evolving theories about basic structure, the basic structure of constitutions, and the links of basic structure with constitutional amendment. So both of those examples, I think, could be instructive for an issue that I raise in Gene Pool, but don't fully pursue, the question about how theory spreads around the constitutional world. Does it accompany the institutions with which it originally developed? Does it spread in whole? Does it spread in part? What happens to it? And I think those are all very important issues, and sort of reflecting on Gene Pool, I like to think that those sorts of things might be included.
Thanks indeed. Very interesting and fascinating as always. You mentioned the basic structure doctrine, and to go to a question which is somehow, related to this concept, I would like to ask, the following question. You have also explored the fascinating terrains of constitution making and the constitutional design in your works, and among the many experiences that have been developed under your intellectual and academic leadership, I would like to mention the Constitution Transformation Network. What do you see as the new challenges for constitutional processes at this stage? I ask also in light of some very interesting processes, such as the Chilean one. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very interesting series of points. And thank you for mentioning Contransnet. My colleagues and I established that network about 6 years ago, and we had two particular questions in mind. One was, what is happening to the very concept of a constitution in conditions of globalization? And the second, much more practical, what can we as comparative scholars contribute to the understanding and execution of individual constitution-making processes, drawing on our global constitutional knowledge and our practical understanding of how negotiations happen in a constitutional context. Now, we've since done a lot of work on both those questions and extended our own understanding. So let me draw on that in answering the substantive question that you put to me. So at one level, of course, the most obvious challenge for any constituent process is to secure an effective outcome. And that seems obvious, but it's the reality that despite all the constitution making that's gone on over the past 30 years, and the statistics tell us that something like 2/3 of the states of the world have amended their constitution in some way or another. Much of that constitution making has been markedly unsuccessful in terms of working effectively for the people of the state concerned, and also lasting for a reasonable period of time, delivering some stability in government. Now, on the face of it, that seems surprising. But then when we think of the particular challenges that those constituent processes face, it's less surprising. Much constitution making over the past 30 years has followed intrastate, internal state conflict. And there's some very interesting questions that are now emerging about the relationship between peace agreements in which the parties undertake constitutional change and the constitutions that follow, coupled with the challenge of implementing those constitutions. Much of that constitution making takes place in societies that are divided. Now, sometimes the divisions are the sort of divisions we're familiar with, divided along ethnic, linguistic, religious lines. But increasingly, as we look at the polarization of many societies around the world, the divisions might not be quite as evident as that. Sometimes they're just divisions along ideological or other sorts of lines. Much of that constitution making, despite those difficulties, is very ambitious. And so we talk a lot about transformative constitutions these days, meaning constitutions that don't just change the institutions and tweak some of the technical features of the previous regime, but that actually seek to transform the society and the economy and so on. A lot of these constitutional processes attract a great deal of international assistance, but that's not always as helpful as it might be. Some of it's very unaware of the context in which these new constitutional arrangements need to fit. And some of the international assistance really overreaches, usurping the role that ultimately local constitution makers, I think, need to execute themselves. And then, of course, as we know, geopolitics is positively unhelpful in many circumstances. And we have only to look at, say, Libya and Syria now to see the unfortunate truth of that. Now, a lot might be said about how to overcome these challenges, but let me make just 3 points about it. One, I think national ownership is very important, and coupled with national ownership, national responsibility. Now, of course, there's a big question about what you mean by national ownership, and that's also a question that needs to be answered in context. It doesn't just mean today's leaders writing the Constitution. It means a much more broader and more involved process than that. And there is a real skill in trying to balance the popular involvement and elite leadership. But nevertheless, I think it's important for the final success of constitutional arrangements. Second issue, the importance of implementation. Any of us who are constitutional scholars know that there's a lot more to a constitution than the text that you manage to negotiate during a constituent process. And what happens then is very important, and we're increasingly being made aware, may take a considerable period of time. If I look at Kenya, for example, Constitution was made in 2010. I think it's only now that you're beginning to see the Constitution really sort of bedding down and developing those sort of integrated features that we know a good Constitution has. And finally, I think we need to accept the reality that constitutions are and always have been made for states, but states that are part of an international system of states. There will always be an involvement of external influences as well as internal factors. And I think if constitution makers are sort of conscious of that reality, they can maybe cater for it a little better than happens at the moment. And it may be that we need to pay more attention to the external face of constitutions. So many of our constitutions focused in considerable detail on the arrangements for governing the states and pay relatively little attention to the way in which a state deals with the outside world, despite the significance of those external arrangements. And finally, if I might just end on the Chilean process, Giuseppe, because you're absolutely right that it is very, very interesting. And we've had a little bit to do with it around the edges at Contransnet. And I think that one of the reasons why it's so interesting, well, three reasons why it's so interesting. One, the process itself is very interesting in Chile, and the causes of the process, I think, is interesting. The desire, apparently on the part of that initiating Congress, to avoid putting in place a purely constituent process, partly because of experiences elsewhere in Latin America. But the attempt to try and tie the process down has been really very, very interesting. Secondly, I think it's an interesting process because it's so ambitious. There's a real desire to explore major change across most areas of governance activity, including, for example, Indigenous self-determination. And the third reason why it's so interesting is that the convention, when it was elected, when was that, last year sometime, proved to be extraordinarily diverse. And that was very interesting in a country that had been a bit inclined to think that the political parties would just reappear in a new form in the constituent body. On the other hand, managing that diversity is one of the really big challenges that constituent process now faces. I mean, can they harness all of that energy and bring people together in the sort of consensus that you hope will be achieved in a constitution-making process? And I think that's what we all need to keep our eye on for the future.
Thanks so much. You also referred to the interaction between the international and the domestic level. And my next question has to do with that. Because as far as I know, you are one of the few non-European scholars to have devoted works to the concept of multi-level constitutionalism. What is the potential of this concept beyond the European context, in your opinion? Thank you.
Well, I have to say, I think that multi-level constitutionalism is one of those many terms that we find in comparative constitutional law that are used differently by different people. And I don't claim to be using it in the sometimes very technical sense that it's used in the European context. I use it rather loosely to refer to multiple levels of government, both below the level of the state and above the level of the state, individually and collectively. And there are two reasons for that. If we focus on the levels of government below the level of the state, decentralization is now a very common phenomenon in many, perhaps most countries, most democratic countries around the world. And it's a very significant dimension of constitutional systems. But relatively few of those decentralized arrangements are formally federal in any sense. I mean, Italy is an example, usually described as regional rather than federal. But we don't really have clear terms that are understood around the world for those serious attempts at decentralization that don't describe themselves as federal. And I tend to use multi-level constitutionalism for that purpose, as a generic purpose to cover serious exercises in decentralization, whether they're federal or not. And that, I think, becomes very handy in some contexts. And then, of course, the other catalyst is that the levels of government above the state are also becoming increasingly significant. Certainly supranationalism as in Europe, but we're also seeing very serious regional arrangements elsewhere in the world, including in Africa. And then, as we know, the international level is also flexing its muscles in various ways. So I think it's helpful also to have a term that can cover those levels of arrangements above the state. And I have spent a little time thinking about these issues over the last few years in particular, because I think that multi-level constitutionalism is a necessity in our current world, And if it's a necessity, I think it should be used to advantage rather than oscillating between sort of unthinking centralization on the one hand and terror about secession on the other. Somehow we need to accept that if we have multiple levels of government, each level of government has a distinctive contribution to make to effective and inclusive government. This is really subsidiarity in action, I think. And if that's right, if each level of government has a contribution to make, then each level needs to understand the contribution that the others can make and respect that contribution, work with it. Now, of course, all of this is easier said than done because most of our constitutional arrangements still operate with the assumptions of a unitary state. It's very hard to avoid the tendency to centralize over time. So I've become interested in trying to develop a distinctive approach in which constitutionalism really takes multi-level government seriously, whatever that might mean.
Thanks so much. Indeed, your research about how the different levels of government interact is one of the main features probably of your fantastic scholarship. And my next question is about one of the topics that you have addressed most in your contributions, namely intergovernmental relations. Intergovernmental relations have always been an important factor for innovation in federal systems, also in the regional system, if we want to make this sometimes artificial distinction. But intergovernmental relations are also often viewed with suspicion by constitutional scholars and by political scientists, because they are seen as non-transparent and they are depicted as a sort of obstacle to the centrality of parliaments. My question is, what do you think about that, and how can these concerns be addressed in your view?
Well, I'm fascinated that you've picked up intergovernmental relations as an aspect of my scholarship, Giuseppe. My PhD all those years ago was on intergovernmental relations in Australia, and like any other doctoral student, that sort of becomes your bread and butter that you really know about deeply and that you return to from time to time. And so indeed, I have been thinking about it and writing a little bit about it again more recently. To come to your question, you know, I'm not convinced that intergovernmental relations necessarily are a factor for innovation. Intergovernmental relations is often a factor for unnecessary centralization. And centralization may encourage innovation, but it may equally stifle innovation. I mean, one of the supposed advantages of multi-level government is that you can have innovation coming from some of the component parts. And if the innovation is successful, then it can spread to the others. And if it's not successful, then it may die away. So that's not to say that I don't think there's a place for intergovernmental relations, because I do, but I tend to think of it in terms of being a useful tool for coordinating governments, and that coordination might serve a variety of different purposes. And I think intergovernmental relations needs to be used deliberately and appropriately when we engage with it. Now, one of the reasons why I've been thinking about this again lately is that what's happened to us all over the last few years with the pandemic, with the emergence of COVID-19 in its various guises, has really shown how multi-level government can work when a complex crisis like that bears out. Complex crisis like that emerges. And so that caused me to give some thought to the way in which intergovernmental processes were used in different parts of the world. And I wrote about it in a piece that was published towards the end of 2020. So I was really only looking at the first year of the pandemic. And these are sort of my conclusions in summary. First of all, I think that all systems of multi-level government use intergovernmental relations, although exactly how they use them and the form that intergovernmental relations takes depends very much on context. I mean, that's even the case with federal systems. As you know, federations differ considerably in their structure, in the way in which powers are divided, in the way in which their institutions interact. And systems of intergovernmental relations really have adapted to those overarching differences in constitutional systems. My second conclusion from thinking about this in the COVID context is that intergovernmental relations need to be designed so as to draw on the contribution of all the participants rather than being top-down. And if you think what those contributions might be, at least in the context of the health crisis, they were things like capability, who's most capable of managing this particular side of the crisis, whether it's providing hospital beds on the one hand or buying vaccines on the other. Which level of government has the greatest knowledge about the problems on the ground so as to be able to respond to what's going on? Which level of government can interact most effectively with the people in a context where you need to really build trust and instill understanding in the population? So I think that intergovernmental relations needs to draw on those potential benefits of multi-level government to the extent that they can. Third point, intergovernmental relations requires coordination, as I suggested earlier, but coordination doesn't necessarily mean uniformity. Sometimes uniformity might be important. Other times coordination might simply involve an exchange of information or some sort of rough harmonization. Again, it's horses for courses. What is the particular problem that is being addressed by the participating governments? And the final point, which I guess is obvious, is that each level of government needs to be capable of delivering on its responsibilities and on its undertakings, given in the context of intergovernmental discussions. And again, it's obvious, but so often ignored. Sometimes with systems of multi-level government, we sort of give up on the lower levels of government and say, well, they can't do it. Power needs to ratchet up. We need to try to be sure that each level of government can play the role that's assigned to it. Otherwise, there's no point in having the system in the first place. Now, of course, you're right that accountability for all of this is an endemic problem. And it's an endemic problem for a number of reasons. One, intergovernmental relations almost automatically largely involves executive government. And accountability is always an issue if significant power is conferred on that branch of government, which by sort of its very nature operates out of the limelight. Second reason why I think accountability is a problem, it goes back a little bit to a point I made earlier. Our systems of accountability typically are designed for unitary systems. Of course, they've been adapted to multi-level government, but the norm is still the unitary system with a single parliament at the centre, which ultimately gets its way. And I think that these sorts of factors that characterise intergovernmental relations is one of the reasons why I suggested earlier that you shouldn't have recourse to them unless they're really needed. In other words, don't go and engage in intergovernmental relations just for the sake of it. Now, there will be many occasions, nevertheless, when intergovernmental relations are used in all systems of multi-level government, raising the accountability problem that you note. And my own view on that is that while we all know that accountability problems are there, surely those problems are not unsolvable. Surely, once we've decided that intergovernmental cooperation is very often a public good, we can adjust our systems of accountability to suit. So to that end, we need to treat intergovernmental relations as a serious and continuing aspect of government that needs to be supported and appropriately organised. And sometimes that involves a system of organisation that straddles the levels of government, for example, isn't owned by one or other of the levels of government. I think accountability for intergovernmental relations requires accountability on the part of all participating governments, not just the centre, whatever that may involve in particular cases. I think we should be much more prepared to use transparency, to harness transparency in the interests of accountability. You know, the idea that, negotiations between governments are a little bit like you find at the international level and they should be kept confidential. That's not necessarily so. Transparency can be very, very useful, as we all know, in enhancing accountability. But equally, I think we need to assume that none of this will happen. Accountability will not improve simply by creating institutions and changing systems. If we really want genuine accountability for intergovernmental relations, we need to think in terms of cultural change as well. And there needs to be pressure from outside the ranks of the political elite, and not just within them and within the bureaucracy and so on. So that's my hope, maybe nirvana, but I think it's worth trying.
Thanks so much food for thought indeed. My last question is instead the following. What topics would you advise young comparatives to explore? That's a big question, I know.
It is a big question, and we could talk about it forever. Really, I think young comparativists should go where their curiosity takes them, and also maximise their own advantages. You know, if a young comparativist is in Europe, where they've had the hands-on experience of supranational government, I think that's an advantage that they can bring to the table. If a young comparativist comes out of one of the Asian countries where there are really no very serious regional arrangements, then they'll have entirely different set of experiences to add to the global discussion on comparative constitutional law. But nevertheless, I think it's possible to identify some very important themes that will, I'm sure, be live themes in coming years, and which need all the brains and the enthusiasm that young comparativists can bring to bear. One is the interface between the local and the global in all its complexity. It's a continuing theme. It's been a continuing theme for probably the last 200 years as well, but it changes its character. And I think to really make significant progress, that may require much better dialogue between comparative constitutional lawyers and international lawyers than we presently see. Not just dialogue, you give your paper on international law and I give mine on constitutional law, but a genuine meeting of the minds to try and see if there are problems that can jointly be solved, or at least questions that can jointly be answered. So I think that's a very big and important topic. It will become more important as regionalism develops, as some of these pressing problems for the world are tackled, including climate change. A second issue is maybe more appropriate for some young comparativists than for others, but let me describe it this way. The operation of constitutional arrangements in states that are not naturally Westphalian states. The world is organized in such a way that everybody has to have a state. And the international order expects the state to operate as a state. But the reality is that the state system does not sit naturally in many parts of the world and in many countries, and against the background of the evolution of many communities. You can insist that, at least for some purposes, they perform as states, but equally for constitutionalists, for people interested in the workings of constitutions and governments and the theories that underpin them, we need to understand what's really going on below the surface of the Constitution in constitutional arrangements of that kind. And I think that's a big challenge, but a very exciting one, and one that is potentially very productive of interesting and new ideas. And let me give you just one final possibility as a topic for young comparativists to explore. My colleagues and I sometimes talk about democracy Mark II. There's a lot of talk about the decline of democracy, and that's all very depressing. But the more positive spin on that is maybe we need to be looking towards new forms of democracy. Maybe the institutions that we all know developed over the course of the 19th century, including the rigidity of party systems around the world, have in many places approached, and in some cases passed, their use by date. What will take their place? What can we creatively do to make democracy work for the people for whom it's designed? And there may be all sorts of things wrapped up in that. It may involve us drawing on some of those experiences with citizens' assemblies and mini publics that we see in parts of Europe, or it may not. But those are issues that I think will be very, very important issues for young comparativists, and for that matter, young constitutional scholars, even within states, for the future.
Thanks so much. Unfortunately, this interview is coming to an end, and it's a pity because I've learned a lot, that I took so many notes. But I would like to thank once again the Professor Cheryl Saunders for her time. We will be in touch, of course, and I think that this has been a fantastic opportunity for us. We learned a lot. So thanks so much once again, Cheryl.
It's been a great pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity.